What is good, everyone? For this video, I'll be covering how to manually change settings for exposure on the fly out there when dealing with changing light, especially when it comes to natural light out there in street photography. And this is part of my photosynthesis series here, where I take any questions from you, topics, ideas, really anything, kind of a catch-all. I take it and I turn it into a video. And this question came up in one of my mentorships here on Patreon, so I decided why not cover it in a video. And that question was, what are some of the ways that I manually change on the fly out there when dealing with changing light, like when the cloud cover changes, or you go down a dark alley and then you go out to the sunlight, all those types of things. When you're shooting manual out there, how do you change for exposure on the fly and do it quickly so it really doesn't interrupt your focus out there and you can get the shot quickly? And this is something that comes up a lot out there. It can get frustrating, frustrates me sometimes when dealing with constantly changing light and having to change for that when it comes to exposure and not miss a shot that's underexposed or overexposed because of it. So there are ways that I've learned to get better at it, especially on the fly shooting manual. So for this, I'm going to first cover some of the frustrations that you'll meet out there when it comes to changing light, the different scenarios. Then I'll go into how my setup for it, and then I'll go into some tips on how to get better at it and how to work around any types of problems you might have out there and be able to change for the exposure on the fly and do it quickly. So starting off, what are some of the scenarios you might see out there when it comes to that changing light where you have to change the exposure to get it exposed right? Well, number one probably is, the number one frustration for me probably is the clouds. When you have a somewhat blue sky day, but there's a lot of individual clouds out there spread out, and constantly the clouds are covering the sun, and then they're uncovering the sun, covering the sun, uncovering. So it's back and forth. So you have that constantly changing light out there, and you do have to change for exposure in the fly when you're shooting manual. Another scenario, common scenario, are buildings. You'll have a building blocking the sun, but if you're on one side maybe of the street, the sun's hitting that side of the street, but then you see something interesting on the other side of the street, so you run over there and now the light is completely different because it has some shadow cast from that building. Or you're going to a undercover, so you're walking down a street and maybe there's a canopy up here or a market here, and so one part has sunlight. If you go under that canopy, then there's shadow, so you're having to go back and forth, especially when you're dealing with some of those bigger markets out there where the light's hitting some parts and then it's not hitting others because of that cover on the different stands. So you have to deal with that. And if you're moving inside a place and moving outside of a place, of course that's going to change the light too. And really when you're out there, sometimes the light, even in one place, it might not be moving side to side or getting blocked. It's just that the light hits at different angles, especially during the middle of the day with the harsh light. There might be parts that don't get any sunlight. So you really have to look when you're out there and see where the light's hitting. But I'll cover that more when we get into the tips. But there's all types of scenarios out there where you're going to have to change for exposure on the fly, especially when you have a sunny day, because that's when you're going to be dealing with bright sunlight and then covered sunlight. So now let's get into some tips out there and how I kind of have my camera set up for it. This is my camera here, and so I always have my camera set. I like to keep the ISO at a certain range. We all have our different settings that we like to keep. Now I'm doing manual zone focus out there, so I like to shoot when there's good light out there, and I can have the aperture pretty narrow out there, so I have a long focal plane, so everything's pretty much in focus. So around 11, f11 to f16, I like it in that range if I can. I really don't like to go below f8 when I'm out there for zone focusing, because I like many of the layers to be in focus, many of the elements to be in focus. So that's pretty important to me to keep the aperture around that range. Then there's shutter speed. I like to have the shutter speed around 1/640th of a second. Used to be 1/500th, but 1/640th of a second is pretty good for me. I don't really see any motion blur or anything like that from my movement. Even when because a lot of my photos I take them pretty quickly, but if I have it at 1/640th, it's good. Now, if I wanted to, I could go, a little slower out there, and we'll cover that, but usually I like to keep it at 1/640th. And then there's ISO. That really is dependent on what your taste is, how much you care about noise out there, how much you don't care, and also your individual camera. Now, back when I used to shoot with a Leica M9, I really could, if you know anything about the Leica M9, the sensor is a great sensor if you're at the low ISO, but once you get to past 400, it gets bad quickly. But with a camera like this, the Fuji X Pro 3, I can go much higher, but I really don't like to go too high at the same time. So my first tip would be to understand how those different settings come together to affect exposure, and also what your preference is on the different settings, because they all can affect the photo in different ways. So once you have that, then we get into what you prefer to change first. So when the natural light out there changes from brighter to darker and you need to adjust for exposure, what are you going to change first? Personally, I would recommend, and what I like, is to change the ISO first. So bring it up first, up to a certain point. So decide what that certain point that you don't want to go above is, and then I would recommend going up there to compensate for the change of light, the lower light out there. So for example, if I'm out there shooting at ISO 800 and then the cloud goes over the sun, I would go up to 1600 if that's going to work. And that would be my first change. I really don't like to go too much higher than that, but I might go up to 3200. But then once you get to that point where you don't want to bring the ISO up anymore, I would recommend changing one of the other two, aperture or shutter speed, and that is really related to which one is more important to you and what kind of photo you're trying to make. So shutter speed, of course, is going to affect how long the shutter is open there, and that can affect motion blur. So if you have a lot of moving parts there or moving people and you don't want motion blur, you're not going to want to change that first. You're probably going to want to change aperture first. But then aperture is going to affect, you know, how wide open the aperture is and the focal range there too. So if you have it like at f/16 and you have to bring it down, now you're not going to have quite as long of a focal range there. It's going to get a little blurrier quicker and or closer to. So you have to think of that when you're out there changing it. So I personally, if I'm at f/16, I would bring it down to f/11, no problem. Maybe f/8, but then down from there, from zone focusing, I probably wouldn't want to change it too much. Then I might go to shutter speed and take it down, you know, to maybe 1/500th first, then maybe 1/360th. You can kind of decide what you really want to do. So to recap real quick, make sure you know what ISO, aperture, and shutter speed does, how it affects the exposure, and how it affects the photo. Decide what you prefer most, what's more important to you, and then put that in order when you're changing for the exposure. And then from there, be able to learn how those different settings will change the exposure, and also learn how to read the light out there. So for example, if you're out there and it's bright and sunny, you know that f/11 or f/16, and maybe you have the ISO at 800 or 400, and you have, you know, shutter speed 1/500th, 1/640th, whatever you have, but you know that you have the perfect exposure then, and then a cloud comes over and you had to change to correct the exposure. Look at how the settings change and memorize that. So now you know whenever a cloud comes over, you need to change it to that certain setting there. Or if you're going down an alley, you probably are going to have to change for the exposure even more dramatically, lower the, you know, widen the aperture more, or increase the ISO more, or lower the shutter speed. Whatever you have to do and whatever you decide you want to do, memorize that for when you're going down an alley, or when you're going under a cover, or when you change from street side to street side. One's being blocked by the light, one has the light shining on it. Look at that and be able to read the light, see it, and know what settings you're going to have to change, and then memorize them, especially when you're going back and forth. It's pretty easy, especially when you have a day where it's bright out and then there's some cloud cover. You're going to know that there's a specific setting for when there's no cloud cover, and there's another setting for when the cloud does come over. So you can just adjust between the two. Same goes for the other scenarios of, you know, building cover or a canopy cover or side of the street. You need to see that, read it, and memorize it, and it doesn't take that long to do that. Just go out there and you can look at your hand and expose for your hand with the sunlight, and then expose for your hand when the cloud cover or the building's in the way, because really you probably, when you're with people, you want the exposure to go along with skin tone. That's one way to do it. But just be able to read the light, memorize it, and know your settings for that exposure that you want. And so you can get the shot in time and manually change for the exposure on the fly like that. Be able to kind of read and predict when that light is going to change. There's a lot of obvious ways to do that. If you know you see something across the street and it has different light, while you're walking over there, you can change it and predict for what exposure you're going to need. Same for when you're seeing the sky. You know when a cloud's about to come over the sun. So if you think that maybe when you take that shot that's going to happen, be prepared for that and ready to change the settings. And then also be aware of your change in settings, the effect of that on the photo. So like I said previously, you're going to want to decide what you prefer and what kind of photos you want, and then change the settings accordingly to get the right exposure. But if you have a dark alley where you really had to take down the shutter speed there, be aware that you're going to have to be really careful when you take the photo. You're going to want to, elbows in. You're not going to want to have any motion blur unless that's the kind of photo you want, but probably not. So just be aware you're going to have to keep that camera extra still compared to when your shutter speed was much quicker. Same with aperture. If you have a layered scene, be aware that you have it, more wide open. So if you want somebody in the foreground here to be in focus, be aware that the aperture is wide open now, so you better get the focal, focus better than you would normally have to when, if it was at f16 and everything was in focus. Same if you have it focused on the foreground there. Be aware that if the aperture is wide open, because of the low light and exposure need, then everything behind it is going to get out of focus speed pretty quickly. So those are really all the tips that I use and that I'd recommend for manually changing for exposure on the fly out there. I have to do it all the time, so the more you have to do it, the more quick it's going to get and the more second nature it's going to become. But really it's about learning how to read the light, learning your settings, and then from there it gets pretty easy. But that brings me to the end of this photosynthesis on manually changing settings for exposure on the fly out there when dealing with changing light. It's a pretty long one there, but hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. Again, this is photosynthesis, so if you have any questions you'd like to see me cover in this series, either questions, it could be topics, could be themes, ideas, really anything. Give me anything. This is a catch-all, and I'll try to make a video, turn it into a video. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video. Cheers.